That night was about to change everything for Matthew, though he didn't know it yet. At 45 years old, Matthew had always prided himself on his discipline, on controlling his emotions, but there was something he couldn't ignore anymore. In the quiet of his suburban home, as the minutes ticked by slowly, he found himself thinking about Robert, his 20-year-old nephew, who had been staying with him for the past few weeks. Robert was blonde, with smooth skin and a smile that was always on the edge of being provocative. His presence seemed to fill the air with a tension that Matthew just couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. After a long day, Matthew collapsed on the couch, exhausted, trying to shut off the thoughts that kept circling in his mind. The TV was on, playing some random show, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was focused on the sound of Robert's footsteps upstairs. Since he'd arrived, everything felt different. The glances they shared were longer, more intense, and the accidental brush of hands in the kitchen or hallway left Matthew's heart racing. He knew something was shifting between them, but he didn't know how to handle it. Not yet. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and Matthew realized Robert was coming downstairs. A strange anxiety tightened in his chest. Robert's presence always made him question what was happening inside him, what boundaries he was slowly losing grip on. Robert appeared in the doorway, dressed casually in a tight shirt and sweatpants that outlined his young body perfectly. His expression was calm, but there was something about the way he leaned against the doorframe, watching Matthew with that half-smile, that made Matthew's heart pound. "Can't sleep?" Matthew asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice came out tenser than expected. Robert shrugged, walking into the room with the air of someone who knew exactly the effect he was having. "Not really," Robert replied in a tone that was too suggestive to be casual, sitting down on the couch next to Matthew, much too close. Matthew could feel the heat radiating off Robert, the fresh scent of his shampoo mixing with the air thick with tension. He was so close that Matthew could feel every subtle movement of his body, and it made him feel things he knew he shouldn't. He tried to focus on the TV, but Robert's presence was an impossible distraction. "Is there something you want to say?" Matthew asked, his voice low, trying to keep control, though he knew something was about to break between them. Robert turned to him, his gaze steady, that smile still lingering on his lips. He let out a soft breath before he spoke. "I think we both know what's going on here, don't we?" Matthew's heart skipped a beat. The air in the room felt heavier. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The way Robert was looking at him, the way he moved closer, slow and deliberate, made everything harder to ignore. "I've noticed how you look at me," Robert continued, his voice now a whisper, but filled with a kind of intensity that made Matthew shiver. "There's no point in pretending anymore." Robert's hand moved slowly, resting on Matthew's leg. The touch was light, but overwhelming. Matthew felt his entire body react, a mixture of desire and guilt battling inside him. He knew this was wrong, but there was something undeniable between them. "Robert," Matthew began, his voice barely above a whisper, but he was cut off by Robert's firm, intense gaze as he leaned in even closer. "You don't have to say anything," Robert said, his hand sliding up Matthew's leg, his breath warm on Matthew's skin. "I know you feel this too." The heat between them intensified, and Matthew couldn't hold back anymore. The desire he had been repressing for so long was on the verge of exploding. He leaned in, feeling Robert's warmth, his proximity, and before he could think, their lips met. The kiss was slow, but filled with overwhelming intensity. Every second, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was no TV, no living room, just the two of them, caught in a wave of desire that had been building for far too long. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, faces close, eyes locked. Matthew knew things would never be the same after that moment. He tried to find the words, but all he felt was the urgency pounding in his veins. Robert, however, seemed calm, though his eyes still held that intensity. He brushed his hand lightly against Matthew's face, a tender gesture that contrasted the excitement of the moment. "This can't be right," Matthew whispered, though his voice held no conviction. "Maybe it's not right, but it's real," Robert replied, his tone calm but firm, before leaning in again, his lips brushing against Matthew's. "And we both know it." Matthew spent the entire night unable to sleep. The hours dragged on as he stared at the ceiling, still trying to make sense of how everything had changed so quickly. The kiss they had shared burned in his mind, replaying over and over like a flame he couldn't extinguish. He knew something had broken that night, a line that should never have been crossed, and now there was no going back. He wanted to believe he could forget, pretend it hadn't happened, but the intensity of that moment haunted him, and the growing desire inside him forced him to face the truth. The next morning, the house was silent. Matthew stepped out of his room slowly, as if afraid to run into Robert at any moment. The silence wasn't comforting. It was the echo of choices he knew he'd have to confront. As he made his way downstairs, he noticed Robert was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, as if last night hadn't happened. But Matthew knew better. The young man sat at the table, dressed casually, but there was a palpable tension in his body, a hesitation in his movements. When Matthew entered the kitchen, Robert looked up, and their eyes met for a moment. It was quick but charged with electricity, both of them fully aware of the unspoken tension. "Morning," Robert said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed the tension they both felt. Matthew just nodded, grabbing a cup of coffee. He knew they couldn't keep going like this. They couldn't just pretend nothing had changed. But at the same time, he didn't know how to start the conversation he dreaded. Everything in his body wanted to run, but the desire, and something deeper, kept him frozen in place. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, like both were waiting for the other to say something. To break the tension, Matthew finally sat down at the table, across from Robert, and let out a heavy sigh, trying to find the courage to speak. "About last night," Matthew began, his voice lower than he intended. Robert looked up, his face neutral, but his eyes shining with something Matthew recognized as a mix of hope and anxiety. "We can't just pretend nothing happened," Matthew continued, feeling the weight of each word. "I know this is complicated, and honestly, I don't know how to handle it." Robert stayed silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving Matthew's. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully before he spoke. "I don't know what it means either," Robert admitted, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "But I know what happened was real. It wasn't a mistake, Matthew. Not for me." Robert's words hit Matthew like a punch in the gut. He knew it hadn't been a mistake, knew there was something there that he couldn't explain, but that didn't make the situation any less complicated. He found himself torn between desire and morality, between passion and fear of the consequences. "I feel something for you, Matthew," Robert continued, his voice firm now, like he was finally ready to face his own feelings. "And I know you feel it too. There's no point in pretending anymore." Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb the weight of Robert's words. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands gripping the coffee cup tightly. He knew Robert was right. There was something between them, something he had been repressing for a long time, but something that couldn't be ignored any longer. Matthew began, but the words seemed too difficult to form. "This isn't something easy to accept. You're my nephew, Robert. This is wrong, isn't it?" Robert shook his head, his eyes softening as he looked at Matthew. "Maybe it's wrong in some people's eyes," he replied calmly, "but I can't control how I feel, and I know you can't either." The silence fell between them again, thick and heavy with emotion. Matthew didn't know what to say, but he knew Robert was right. He couldn't deny what he felt, even if it went against everything he'd believed until now. Robert stood slowly from the table, walking around until he was standing beside Matthew. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the growing tension, with the desire neither of them knew how to control. He moved closer, his hand resting lightly on Matthew's shoulder, the touch warm, but filled with meaning. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," Robert said, his voice low and close, "but we can at least stop pretending." Matthew looked at him, his heart racing in his chest. He knew what Robert was saying made sense, but there was so much at stake. Yet, at the same time, there was no denying the pull between them. He could feel it in every fiber of his being, and resisting it felt like trying to stop a wave from crashing against the shore. Without another word, Robert leaned down, his lips brushing softly against Matthew's. This kiss was different from the one the night before, slower, deeper, filled with all the emotions that had been building between them. Matthew hesitated for only a second before giving in completely. His hand reached up to pull Robert closer, and the rest of the world seemed to disappear around them. When they finally pulled apart, Matthew's breath was shaky. He knew they had crossed a line they could never come back from, but part of him didn't care anymore. "I don't know where this goes," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. Robert smiled softly, brushing his hand against Matthew's cheek. "We'll figure it out, together." The days that followed the moment between Matthew and Robert were filled with a quiet tension. Both of them knew something had changed, but neither was willing to push the conversation further. What was undeniable, though, was that the dynamic between them had shifted. Casual touches became loaded with meaning. Glances held longer than they should have, and the space between them felt charged in a way that was impossible to ignore. One evening, after a long day, Matthew sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV while his mind raced with thoughts of Robert. He knew they couldn't keep going like this, living in limbo between what they wanted and the fear of what it meant. Just as Matthew was lost in thought, Robert appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately making the air feel heavier. He leaned against the doorframe, watching Matthew with that familiar, playful smile that always made Matthew's heart race. "You've been avoiding me," Robert said casually, though there was a hint of something deeper in his voice. Matthew sighed, knowing he couldn't keep running from this conversation. "We need to talk." Robert raised an eyebrow, stepping into the room with a confidence that made Matthew's pulse quicken. Robert always knew how to push his buttons, how to walk that fine line between teasing and something more serious. "Talk," Robert said, his tone light, but his eyes were intense. "I thought we were past that by now." Robert moved closer, and Matthew's body reacted immediately, tensing with both anticipation and anxiety. The younger man sat beside him on the couch, close enough that their legs touched, and Matthew could feel the heat from his body. Whatever this is, it's complicated," Matthew said, his voice quieter than he intended. "You're my nephew, Robert. This shouldn't be happening." Robert's smile faded, and he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on Matthew's knee. "Maybe you're making it more complicated than it has to be." Matthew looked into Robert's eyes, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between them. He wanted to resist, wanted to tell Robert to stop, but the truth was, he didn't want that. He wanted more, and that terrified him. "We're playing with fire," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'm not sure how to handle it." Robert leaned in closer, his hand sliding up Matthew's arm, the touch sending shivers down Matthew's spine. "You don't have to handle it," Robert whispered, his breath warm against Matthew's skin. "Just let it happen." And then, before Matthew could protest, Robert kissed him again. The kiss was deep, filled with all the tension and unspoken desires that had been building between them for weeks. Matthew knew this was dangerous, knew they were crossing a line that could never be undone, but in that moment he didn't care. He kissed Robert back, pulling him closer, letting himself drown in the heat of the moment. Every touch, every breath was electric, and Matthew felt like he was losing control, but maybe that's what he wanted. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Matthew's mind was spinning, his heart racing with the weight of what they had just done. "I can't stop this," Matthew admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to." Robert smiled, brushing his fingers through Matthew's hair. "Then don't." Matthew knew that something had changed irreversibly after that night. Everything he had been holding in for so long was beginning to crumble, and the thin line between right and wrong seemed more blurred than ever. Each touch from Robert was a reminder of how deeply he was losing control, and on the surface, he was still trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, but inside, his thoughts were consumed by the intensity of what was happening between them. That afternoon, Matthew came home after another long day at work, his mind heavy with thoughts of Robert. He knew they needed to talk, to figure out what this meant, but every time they were alone together, words became impossible. As he walked into the house, the silence was thick, but Matthew could sense Robert's presence before he even saw him. Sure enough, Robert was sitting in the living room, lounging casually on the couch, a sly smile playing on his lips as he watched Matthew enter. "You look tense," Robert said, his tone playful but laced with an underlying seriousness. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had to find a way to navigate this, but every time Robert was near, his mind became foggy with desire. "We need to talk," Matthew said, though he wasn't sure how to start the conversation. His body was reacting to Robert's presence in ways he couldn't control. Robert stood up slowly, moving toward Matthew with a smooth, confident stride. His eyes were locked on Matthew's, and the intensity in his gaze made it impossible for Matthew to look away. "Talk?" Robert echoed, his voice soft but teasing. He stood in front of Matthew now, close enough that their bodies were almost touching. "Or maybe we should stop talking and just let this happen." Matthew tried to back away, but Robert's hand slid gently over his arm, holding him in place. The warmth of Robert's touch was enough to make Matthew's resolve crumble. "Robert, this is serious," Matthew said, though his voice wavered with the conflict inside him. "We almost got caught the other day. If this happens again..." Robert leaned in closer, his smile fading into something more intense. His breath was warm on Matthew's skin as he whispered, "I know, but we're already in too deep to stop now." Matthew knew Robert was right. They had already crossed the line, and there was no going back. But the fear of being discovered weighed heavily on him, even as desire took over. Matthew felt the weight of Robert's words pressing down on him. Robert was right. They were already in too deep to turn back now, and though his mind screamed that this had to stop, his body told a different story. Every time Robert was near, the line between what was right and what they both wanted blurred even more. Before Matthew could respond, Robert's hand slid up his arm, gentle but deliberate, making Matthew shiver at the contact. Their faces were just inches apart now, and the tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. "You know you can't resist this," Robert whispered, his voice low, seductive. "And honestly, I don't want you to." Matthew's breath hitched. He knew they should talk, should find a way to make sense of all this. But every rational thought flew out the window the second Robert touched him. His heartbeat quickened as he felt Robert's hand trail up to his shoulder, then his neck, pulling him in closer. "We can't keep doing this," Matthew said, his voice barely a whisper, but the protest sounded weak, even to him. "Why not?" Robert murmured, his lips brushing lightly against Matthew's ear. "What's stopping us, really?" And with that, Matthew felt something inside him snap. He couldn't hold back anymore. With a low groan, he pulled Robert closer, crashing their lips together in a heated, desperate kiss. Robert responded immediately, wrapping his arms around Matthew's neck, pulling him in tight as the kiss deepened. Everything else fell away. There were no more questions, no more worries about being caught, no more hesitation. There was only the intense, overwhelming need for Robert that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even longer. And now that Matthew had finally given in, there was no going back. They stumbled backward, bodies pressed together, hands grasping at each other as if afraid to let go. Matthew's back hit the wall, but the shock of it only made him more desperate. He kissed Robert harder, deeper, his hands tangled in Robert's hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel every inch of him. For a moment, they were lost in each other, the world around them fading into nothing. But then, suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open shattered the moment. Matthew froze, pulling back abruptly. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Robert looked just as shocked, his eyes wide, his lips swollen from the kiss. They both turned toward the door, panic seizing them. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, getting closer. "Shit," Matthew whispered, running a hand through his hair. "We need to..." But before he could finish the sentence, the door swung open, and standing there, looking confused, was one of Matthew's neighbors, Mrs. Hill. Matthew's heart dropped into his stomach. His body went rigid, every nerve on high alert. Mrs. Hill was nosy, always paying attention to what was going on around the neighborhood. If she saw something, if she suspected anything. "Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew," Mrs. Hill said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "I didn't mean to intrude. Your door was unlocked and I thought I heard something. Is everything okay?" Matthew forced a smile, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just, talking." Mrs. Hill's gaze flickered between Matthew and Robert, her brow furrowing slightly. Matthew's heart pounded in his ears, his mind racing with excuses, but she didn't seem to pick up on anything. "Well, if you need anything, I'm just next door," she said, lingering for a moment longer before finally turning to leave. As soon as the door closed, Matthew exhaled, his body sagging with relief. They had been so close to being caught, too close. He turned to Robert, who was still standing there, a mix of shock and amusement on his face. "That was close," Robert said, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Too close," Matthew muttered, running a hand over his face. "We need to be more careful. If anyone finds out—" "They won't," Robert interrupted, stepping closer to Matthew, his voice soft but confident. "No one's going to find out, Matthew, as long as we're smart about it." Matthew wanted to believe him, but the fear of being discovered was still too strong. He knew what they were doing was risky, and each time they got closer to being caught, the danger seemed more real. "I don't know if we can keep this up," Matthew admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "It's getting too dangerous." Robert's smile softened, and he reached out, taking Matthew's hand in his own. The touch was gentle, comforting. "I know it's complicated," Robert said quietly, his eyes locking with Matthew's. "But I'm not ready to stop, and I don't think you are either." Matthew looked into Robert's eyes, and despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, he knew Robert was right. He wasn't ready to stop. He didn't want to stop. No matter how dangerous this was, no matter how much they risked, he couldn't walk away from what they had. Not yet. The days after the almost disastrous encounter with Mrs. Hill brought a new level of tension into Matthew's life. He could barely focus on anything, knowing how close they had come to being found out. The idea of everything between him and Robert being exposed so suddenly terrified him. Every step, every move, felt like it was being watched, even though it was probably just his paranoid mind playing tricks on him. Robert, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the danger. There was a spark in his eyes whenever they were alone, as if the risk only fueled his desire for Matthew, and in some twisted way, that made it all the more impossible for Matthew to resist. One evening, Matthew was sitting in his living room, trying to distract himself with work, but his mind kept wandering to Robert, who was upstairs. The tension in the house was thick, and Matthew knew that sooner or later, they would have to face what was happening between them. Just as he was about to get up, Robert appeared in the doorway. He was dressed casually, his hair slightly tousled, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he smiled at Matthew, that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. "You're avoiding me," Robert said softly, stepping into the room, that familiar mischievous glint in his eyes. Matthew let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "We need to talk." Robert raised an eyebrow, moving closer with that same confident stride that always made Matthew's pulse quicken. "Talk?" Robert teased, sitting down beside Matthew, his knee brushing against Matthew's leg. "I thought we were past talking by now." Matthew's breath caught in his throat. Robert was so close now, the heat from his body radiating, pulling Matthew in. He knew they were on dangerous ground, but every time Robert was near, it felt impossible to think straight. "This is serious," Matthew said, his voice barely above a whisper, but even he could hear the doubt in his words. "We almost got caught." Robert's smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew more intense. He leaned in, his hand resting lightly on Matthew's arm, his touch sending shivers through Matthew's body. "Maybe that's what makes it exciting," Robert whispered, his lips dangerously close to Matthew's ear. The risk. The tension between Matthew and Robert only kept growing with each passing day. Every time they met in secret, the desire felt more urgent, more impossible to control. But along with that came a new kind of fear, the fear of being caught. They were living dangerously now, and Matthew knew that. The guilt mixed with the rush of being with Robert was a whirlwind he couldn't pull himself out of. One evening, Robert was lounging casually on the couch, that same carefree look on his face. But Matthew could see the fire in his eyes, the way he looked at him with a spark that said this was more than just a game to him. Matthew walked into the room, trying to keep things under control, but his heart was pounding, and the room seemed to close in around them. "We can't keep doing this," Matthew said, his voice a little rough, though he was barely holding it together. "It's getting too dangerous." Robert turned to him with a slow, deliberate smile. He stood up, walking toward Matthew with the same confidence he always had, and stopped just inches away, so close that Matthew could feel the heat radiating off him. "Maybe that's what makes it worth it," Robert murmured, his tone low and provocative. "You like the risk, don't you?" Matthew tried to back up, but Robert's hand was already on his arm, pulling him in. The touch was light, but firm, and Matthew's resolve began to crumble as Robert's body pressed against his. I don't know if we can handle it," Matthew said, but his voice came out weaker than he intended, his breath catching as Robert leaned even closer. "You don't need to handle it," Robert whispered, his breath warm on Matthew's neck. "Just feel it." And before Matthew could say anything else, Robert kissed him, hard and desperate, like he was afraid they'd run out of time. Matthew didn't resist. He kissed him back, pulling Robert closer, his hands gripping his back as the tension between them exploded. Every second was filled with heat, and Matthew knew they were walking on thin ice. But in that moment, he didn't care. They stumbled back, Matthew's back hitting the wall as Robert's hands ran up his body. Both of them caught up in the rush. It was all-consuming, and Matthew was losing himself completely to the moment. But then, just as things heated up, the doorbell rang, cutting through the haze like a cold shock of reality. They froze, both of them breathing hard, their eyes wide with panic. Matthew's heart was racing as the realization hit them. Someone was at the door. Who is it? Matthew asked, his voice a little frantic, trying to push Robert back. Robert stepped away quickly, his face serious now. As the tension shifted from desire to fear, the sound of footsteps on the porch made Matthew's blood run cold. "You need to get out of here," Matthew whispered urgently. "Now!" Robert nodded, already heading toward the window at the side of the room. He slipped through it quietly, disappearing, just as the doorbell rang again. More insistently this time. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves before heading to the door. When he opened it, he was met with the familiar face of his best friend, Jake. "Hey man," Jake greeted cheerfully, completely oblivious to what had just almost happened. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you wanted to grab a drink." Matthew forced a smile, trying to hide the fact that his heart was still racing. Yeah, sure. Just give me a minute." Jake glanced over Matthew's shoulder, his brow furrowing slightly as he noticed the open window. "Everything all right? Why's the window open?" Matthew's mind raced for an excuse, but he quickly shrugged it off. "Just airing out the room. It's been stuffy." Jake didn't seem to think much of it, nodding casually. "Cool, no worries." As Jake waited by the door, Matthew closed the window and took a few moments to steady himself. Robert was gone, but the heat of what had just happened still clung to the air. They had been so close to getting caught, too close. Once Matthew composed himself, he grabbed his keys and joined Jake, trying to act as if everything was normal, but his mind was still stuck on the moment that had nearly destroyed everything. That night, after Matthew returned from drinks with Jake, he found Robert waiting for him. His heart skipped a beat, and though he knew it was reckless, he couldn't stop himself from going to him. "We almost got caught," Matthew said, his voice low and serious. "This has to stop." But Robert didn't seem fazed. In fact, he smiled, leaning in close once again. "Maybe getting caught is part of the fun." Matthew's breath hitched as Robert's hand slid up his arm, his touch sending a wave of heat through him. He knew this was dangerous. He knew they were playing with fire, but every time Robert touched him, he found it harder and harder to resist. "We're not stopping, are we?" Matthew asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Robert grinned, his eyes dark and intense as he leaned in. "We're not." And once again, Matthew gave in to the desire that had taken over everything. Matthew knew they were pushing the limits now. Every time he and Robert met in secret, the intensity between them grew. The risk, the danger, it all seemed to fuel their desire. But with each passing day, the weight of what they were doing felt heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a game they couldn't win. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthew sat in his bedroom, his mind swirling with thoughts of Robert. They had been avoiding serious conversations, pretending that everything was under control, but Matthew knew better. The desire between them was becoming too much to handle, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep it a secret. Robert slipped into the room quietly as he always did. His smile was soft, but there was something more intense in his eyes tonight. He closed the door behind him and moved toward Matthew, the tension between them immediately thickening the air. "You know this can't last forever," Matthew said, though his voice lacked conviction. Robert shrugged, sitting on the edge of the bed beside him. "Maybe not, but we don't have to figure it all out right now." Matthew turned to face him, the weight of everything they had been doing pressing down on him. "We're getting reckless, Robert. Someone's going to find out, and when they do..." Robert leaned in, cutting him off with a soft kiss. The touch of his lips was enough to make Matthew forget the fear, if only for a moment. But as they pulled away, the reality of their situation came crashing back down. "We'll figure it out," Robert said softly, his hand brushing against Matthew's cheek. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Matthew closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. He knew Robert was right. They had crossed a line they could never come back from, and there was no denying the connection between them. But the fear of being discovered still gnawed at him, no matter how much he wanted to believe they could handle it. The days were blending together, each one a reminder that Matthew and Robert were treading on dangerous ground. The more they gave into their desire, the deeper they found themselves entangled in a web of secrecy, guilt, and undeniable attraction. Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, and yet, every time Robert looked at him, every time they touched, all those fears dissolved into the background. One evening, Matthew found himself standing by the window, staring out at the darkening sky, lost in thought. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. Robert was out, and though Matthew hadn't asked where he'd gone, a part of him was anxious about it. There was something off about the day, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He wasn't used to feeling this on edge. The last few weeks had been a constant balance between passion and paranoia, but tonight felt different. As the minutes ticked by, the anxiety gnawed at him, and Matthew couldn't help but wonder if they had pushed things too far. A sound at the door made him jump, His heart raced as he turned to see Robert stepping into the room. His face flushed from the cold outside. Matthew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Where were you?" Matthew asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the edge of worry was clear. Robert shrugged, unbothered by the tension in Matthew's voice. "Just out for a walk. Needed some air." But Matthew wasn't convinced. Something about the way Robert was acting felt different tonight. The air between them had always been thick with desire. But now there was something else, something heavier. "Are you sure?" Matthew pressed, stepping closer. His brow furrowed. Robert looked up at him, his eyes darker than usual. "Matthew, we're fine. No one knows. No one suspects anything. You need to stop worrying." But Matthew couldn't stop worrying. It was in his nature. And this relationship, this secret, wasn't something that could be kept forever. They were playing with fire, and it felt like the flames were about to consume them both. As Matthew opened his mouth to respond, there was a sudden, sharp knock on the door. Both men froze, their eyes locking in an instant of shared panic. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as the knock came again, louder this time. "Who the hell could that be?" Matthew whispered, his voice tight with fear. Robert shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know." The knock came again, more insistent now, and Matthew's stomach twisted into knots. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. His mind raced, trying to come up with a reason, an excuse, anything that could explain away the tension that was filling the room. Slowly, Matthew moved toward the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. He glanced at Robert, who stood rigid, his expression unreadable. With a deep breath, Matthew opened the door. Standing there, in the dim light of the porch, was Jake. His face was unreadable, his eyes sharp as they flicked between Matthew and the dimly lit hallway behind him. "Jake," Matthew said, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here?" Jake didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was piecing together a puzzle. Finally, he crossed his arms, leaning against the door frame with a look of suspicion on his face. "I've been hearing some things, Matthew," Jake said, his voice calm but laced with accusation. "Things about you. And Robert." Matthew's blood ran cold. He tried to force a smile, but it felt hollow. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jake." But Jake wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Matthew's. "People are talking. I've seen things. The way you two act around each other, it doesn't add up. I need to know what's going on." Matthew felt the walls closing in around him. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but everything felt too exposed, too raw. Jake wasn't just guessing. He knew something. Before Matthew could speak, Robert appeared behind him, his face calm, but his eyes flashing with defiance. "It's not what you think, Jake." Jake's gaze shifted to Robert, and Matthew saw the flicker of realization in his friend's eyes. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Matthew knew there was no easy way out of this. "I don't think you understand what this looks like," Jake said, his voice growing harder. "Whatever it is you're doing, people will find out, and you won't be able to walk away from it." Robert's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "We don't owe you any explanation, Jake. This is between us." Matthew felt his heart drop. This was spiraling out of control. Jake was too close to the truth, and Robert's defiance was only making things worse. "You can't just—" Jake started, but before he could finish, Robert stepped closer, his voice sharp and cold. "Leave," Robert said, his voice dripping with finality. "Now!" For a moment, Jake looked like he was going to argue, but then his expression hardened. He took a step back, his eyes burning with anger. "This isn't over, Matthew," Jake said, his voice low and threatening. "People will know, and when they do, you'll regret this." Without another word, Jake turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Matthew stood there, his body trembling, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Robert moved closer, placing a hand on Matthew's arm, but the touch felt different now. Everything felt different. "We're screwed," Matthew whispered, his voice shaking. "He's going to tell everyone." Robert's expression softened, and he shook his head. "No, he won't. Not if we make sure he doesn't." Matthew turned to Robert, confusion and fear swirling in his chest. "What are you talking about?" Robert's eyes were cold, calculating, as he stepped closer. "Jake's not going to say anything if we make sure he can't." The weight of Robert's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Matthew felt his stomach churn as he realized what Robert was suggesting. "No," Matthew whispered, shaking his head. "We're not doing that. We're not." But Robert's expression didn't change. He moved closer, his voice low and dangerous. "We don't have a choice, Matthew. If we let him go, everything we've built will come crashing down. Is that what you want?" Matthew's heart raced, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the Robert he knew. This was someone darker, someone willing to do whatever it took to protect their secret. "I can't," Matthew said, his voice cracking. "I can't do this." Robert stepped back, his expression hardening. "Then you're willing to throw it all away, everything we have?" Matthew looked at him, his heart breaking under the weight of the decision he had to make. He didn't want to lose Robert, didn't want to lose what they had, but this was too far. "I don't know," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. Robert's face softened for a moment, but the coldness in his eyes remained. "Think about it, Matthew, because if you don't act, someone else will." And with that, Robert turned and walked away, leaving Matthew standing alone in the suffocating silence.